The locker room reeked of sweat and cruelty, the air thick with the jeers of teenage boys who thought power came from tearing others down. Brandon Carter, barely 16, stood frozen as a fist slammed into his locker, inches from his face. "Freak!" hissed Jake Ramsey, his voice a venomous blade, slicing through Brandon's fragile courage. High school in the small town of Willow Creek, Ohio, was a battlefield for Brandon. His soft-spoken nature and the secret he guarded, that he was gay, made him a target. Jake, the star quarterback with a smirk that could curdle milk, had made it his mission to make Brandon's life hell. It started with whispers, then shoves, then punches thrown in shadowed corners of the school. Brandon learned to shrink, to disappear into the edges of hallways. But Jake's radar for weakness was relentless. The worst part? Brandon couldn't tell anyone. His parents, devout and traditional, would never understand. His friends, if he could call them that, had drifted away, unwilling to be tainted by association. One October afternoon, after a particularly brutal encounter where Jake and his crew cornered Brandon behind the bleachers, something snapped. Bruised and trembling, Brandon ran to the only place he felt safe, the town library. Tucked in a corner with a tattered copy of The Great Gatsby, he let the words blur through his tears. That's when he first saw Ethan Ramsey, Jake's older brother, shelving books as a volunteer. Ethan was everything Jake wasn't, kind-eyed, quiet, with a presence that felt like a warm hearth in a storm. At 20, Ethan was in his second year at the local community college, and his reputation as the good Ramsey preceded him. He noticed Brandon's tear-streaked face and slid into the chair across from him. "You okay?" Ethan's voice was gentle, like he was coaxing a wounded animal. Brandon shook his head, unable to speak. Ethan didn't push. Instead, he handed Brandon a tissue and sat in silence, his presence a quiet anchor. That moment planted seed, one that would take years to bloom. High school dragged on, each day a gauntlet. Jake's bullying grew bolder, fueled by rumors about Brandon's sexuality that had started to spread. By senior year, Brandon was outed when a classmate caught him writing a love letter he never meant to send. The fallout was swift, graffiti on his locker, slurs shouted in the halls, and a chilling silence from his parents when he finally confessed. Through it all, Ethan became his refuge. Their library meetings turned into coffee shop hangouts, then long walks by Willow Creek's lake. Ethan listened, never judged, and shared his own struggles, growing up in the shadow of a toxic family, where his father's expectations and Jake's aggression suffocated him. By the time Brandon graduated, he was in love. Not the fleeting kind, but the bone-deep, world-altering kind. Ethan, with his crooked smile and endless patience, felt the same. Their first kiss, under a starlit sky by the lake, was a rebellion against every cruel word Brandon had endured. But love, as Brandon would learn, was never simple, especially when it came to the Ramsey family. Jake's discovery of their relationship was explosive. He cornered Brandon outside a diner, his face a mask of rage. "You're screwing my brother?" he spat, shoving Brandon against a wall. Ethan stepped in, pulling Jake back, but the damage was done. The Ramsey household, already fractured, erupted into chaos. Their father, a stern man who saw Ethan's gentleness as weakness, disapproved of the relationship, not because of Brandon's gender, but because it tied Ethan to a loser like Brandon. Jake, meanwhile, saw it as a betrayal, a stain on his warped sense of family honor. As Brandon and Ethan's bond deepened, the ripples spread. Willow Creek, with its small-town gossip, turned their love into a scandal. Ethan's mother, the only Ramsey who showed Brandon kindness, was caught in the crossfire, pleading for peace while her family tore itself apart. Brandon, haunted by his past but emboldened by Ethan's love, faced a choice: fight for their future or let the weight of hate pull them under. The air in Willow Creek grew heavier as winter settled in, blanketing the town in snow and suspicion. Brandon and Ethan's relationship, once a private sanctuary, was now a public spectacle. Whispers followed them: grocery store aisles, the local diner, even the library where they'd first connected. Brandon, now 19 and working part-time at a bookstore while taking community college classes, felt the weight of every stare. Ethan, ever steady, held his hand through it all, but even his strength wavered under the strain of his family's unraveling. Jake's rage hadn't cooled. If anything, it burned hotter, fueled by a toxic mix of jealousy and pride. He'd always been the golden son, the one their father, Richard Ramsey, pinned his hopes on. Ethan, with his quiet defiance and refusal to play the macho role, was a disappointment. Jake saw Brandon as an intruder, someone who'd not only turned his brother, but also stolen the one person who'd ever challenged his dominance. One night, Jake showed up at Ethan's apartment, drunk and belligerent, pounding on the door while Brandon was there. "You think you could just waltz in and ruin everything?" Jake slurred, his breath sour with whiskey. Ethan stood firm, blocking the doorway, but Brandon saw the flicker of fear in his eyes. Jake's threats weren't empty. He'd always back them up with fists. When Ethan finally got Jake to leave, the silence that followed was deafening. Brandon curled up on Ethan's couch, trembling, wondering if love was worth this war. Richard Ramsey's disapproval was colder, more calculated. He summoned Ethan to the family's sprawling house on the edge of town, a place that reeked of old money and older grudges. "End it," Richard said, his voice like steel. "You're throwing away your future for some kid who's nothing but trouble." Ethan refused, his jaw set, but the words cut deep. Richard's ultimatum came next: cut ties with Brandon, or lose his inheritance, his place in the family. Ethan walked out without a word, but the weight of that choice clung to him. Brandon, meanwhile, was grappling with his own demons. His parents, still reeling from his coming out, had all but disowned him. His mother sent occasional texts, pleading for him to fix himself, while his father hadn't spoken to him in months. The bookstore became his refuge, where his boss, a kind older woman named Clara, treated him like family. But even Clara's warmth couldn't shield him from the town's judgment. When a group of Jake's old high school friends vandalized the bookstore's windows with slurs, Brandon's resolve cracked. He started to wonder if he was the problem, if his love for Ethan was a curse. Ethan sensed Brandon's doubt and took him to their spot by the lake one freezing evening. The water was half frozen, reflecting the pale moonlight. "I'm not giving up on us," Ethan said, his voice fierce. "Not for my father. Not for Jake. Not for this damn town." He pulled Brandon into a kiss, desperate and defiant, as if they could hold the world at bay. For a moment, they believed they could. But the world had other plans. Jake's anger spilled over into a public confrontation at the town's winter festival. In front of a crowd, he shoved Brandon, calling him names that echoed through the icy air. Ethan stepped in, and for the first time, the brothers came to blows. The fight was brutal, raw, and ended with both bloodied and breathless. The crowd stunned into silence. Ethan's mother, Helen, rushed to separate them, her face a mask of grief. Brandon stood frozen, the weight of his existence feeling like the spark that had ignited this chaos. As the festival dispersed, Helen pulled Brandon aside. "You're not the problem," she said softly, her eyes red from crying. "But this family were broken, and I don't know how to fix it." Her words were a lifeline, but they also underscored the truth. Loving Ethan meant waging a war not just against Jake, but against a family and a town that refused to bend. Spring brought tentative hope to Willow Creek, but for Brandon, it felt like the calm before a storm. At 20, he was finding his footing, his grades were strong, and Clara had promoted him to assistant manager at the bookstore. Ethan, now 22, was interning at a local nonprofit, his passion for helping others shining through. Their love had deepened, a quiet rebellion against the town's disapproval. But the scars of the winter festival fight lingered, and Jake's silence was more ominous than his rage. Ethan's mother, Helen, became their unexpected ally. She invited Brandon to dinner at a small cafe outside town, away from prying eyes. "I see how happy you make Ethan," she said, her voice heavy with guilt. "I should have protected him from Richard and Jake years ago." She shared stories of Ethan's childhood, how he'd always been a dreamer, sketching landscapes and reading poetry while Jake chased trophies. Brandon felt a pang of gratitude, but also fear. Helen's support was a crack in the Ramsey family's armor, but it came at a cost. Jake hadn't disappeared. He'd been plotting. He dropped out of college and fallen in with a rough crowd, his anger festering. One night, Brandon found his car, tires slashed. A note tucked under the wiper, "Leave him or else." Ethan wanted to confront Jake, but Brandon begged him to let it go. "He's your brother," Brandon said, his voice breaking. "I don't want to be the reason you lose him forever." Ethan's eyes darkened, but he nodded, pulling Brandon close. "You're my family now," he whispered. The tension escalated when Richard Ramsey made his next move. He froze Ethan's trust fund, cutting off his tuition and rent money. Ethan took a second job, his face etched with exhaustion, but he refused to bow to his father's demands. Brandon, desperate to help, offered to move in together to split costs. It was a leap, both thrilling and terrifying. They found a tiny apartment above a hardware store, its walls thin but their love thick enough to fill the space. Late nights were spent cooking cheap meals, laughing over burnt pasta, and dreaming of a future beyond Willow Creek. But Jake's shadow loomed. He started showing up at the bookstore, glaring from across the street. One evening, he cornered Brandon as he closed up shop. "You think you've won?" Jake sneered, stepping too close. "Ethan's just confused." "Your phase." Brandon's heart pounded, but he stood tall. "He loves me," he said, his voice steady for the first time. Jake's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Brandon thought he'd swing. Instead, Jake spat on the ground and walked away, leaving Brandon shaken but unbroken. The real blow came from an unexpected source. Brandon's parents, who'd been distant but civil. Sent him a letter. It was formal, cold, and final. They were moving to another state and wanted no contact. The rejection stung like a fresh wound. Ethan found him crying in their apartment. The letter crumpled in his hand. "You don't need them," Ethan said fiercely, wrapping Brandon in his arms. "You've got me, and I'm not going anywhere." But Brandon couldn't shake the fear that he was dragging Ethan into a life of sacrifice. As summer approached, Helen invited them to a family barbecue, a tentative olive branch. Brandon hesitated, but Ethan insisted. "We can't hide forever," he said. The barbecue was tense, with Richard's icy silence and Jake's brooding presence. But Helen's warmth and a few kind cousins gave Brandon a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could carve out a place in this fractured family. But when Jake pulled Ethan aside, their heated whispers carrying across the yard, Brandon's stomach churned. The war wasn't over, it was just beginning. Summer in Willow Creek buzzed with heat and unspoken grudges. Brandon and Ethan's apartment, though cramped, was their haven, a place where they could shut out the world. But the world kept knocking. Jake's threats had quieted, but his presence lingered like a storm cloud. Brandon, now 21, threw himself into work and school, trying to outrun the fear that he was a burden to Ethan. Ethan, at 23, was juggling 2 jobs and his internship, his exhaustion masked by fierce devotion. Their love was a lighthouse, but the waves crashing against it were relentless. The barbecue had left a mark. Helen's support was unwavering, but Richard's disapproval was a constant pressure. He'd started spreading rumors in town, painting Ethan as a disappointment and Brandon as a troublemaker. The gossip reached Clara at the bookstore, who brushed it off but warned Brandon to be careful. "Small towns hold grudges," she said, her eyes kind but worried. Brandon nodded, but the weight of being the town's pariah was crushing. One humid July evening, Ethan came home with a split lip. "Jake," he said simply, collapsing onto the couch. Brandon's heart sank as Ethan recounted the fight. Jake had ambushed him outside the nonprofit, ranting about family loyalty. "I told him he doesn't get to decide who I love," Ethan said, his voice raw. Brandon cleaned the cut, his hands shaking, and made Ethan promise not to confront Jake again. But Ethan's silence was heavy, and Brandon knew he was holding back his own anger to protect him. The breaking point came when Jake crossed the line. Late one night, Brandon woke to the sound of shattering glass. Someone had thrown a brick through their apartment window, with a note tied to it, "Fags don't belong here." Ethan called the police, but in a town where the Ramseys held sway, the investigation went nowhere. Brandon's fear turned to rage. He was tired of hiding, tired of being the victim. "We need to fight back," he told Ethan, his voice steady despite the tears. Ethan agreed, but his eyes held a flicker of doubt. Fighting meant facing his family head-on. They decided to confront Richard, hoping to reason with him. At the Ramsey house, Richard was cold, his words cutting. "You're choosing this over your own blood?" he asked Ethan, ignoring Brandon. Ethan stood firm. "I'm choosing love over hate." Richard's face hardened, and he gave Ethan an ultimatum: leave Brandon, or be cut off completely. Ethan chose Brandon, walking out with nothing but the clothes on his back. Helen, watching from the doorway, wept silently. The aftermath was brutal. Ethan lost access to his trust fund, and their finances grew tighter. Brandon took extra shifts at the bookstore, but the stress was wearing them down. One night, as they lay in bed, Ethan whispered, "I'd do it all again for you." Brandon's heart swelled, but guilt gnawed at him. Was he worth this sacrifice? The question haunted him, especially when Jake's next move came. Jake, spiraling deeper into anger, rallied his old high school crew to harass Brandon. They followed him to work, slashed his tires again, and left threatening voicemails. Brandon refused to tell Ethan, not wanting to add to his burden. But when Ethan found out, his fury was unlike anything Brandon had seen. "He's my brother, but he's gone too far," Ethan said, his voice shaking. They decided to leave Willow Creek, to start fresh somewhere new. It was a dream born of desperation, but gave them hope. As they began planning their escape, Helen reached out with a plan of her own. She'd been saving money in secret, determined to help Ethan and Brandon build a life away from Willow Creek's poison. Her support was a beacon, but it also meant defying Richard and risking Jake's wrath. Fall painted Willow Creek in fiery hues, but for Brandon and Ethan, the beauty was overshadowed by urgency. Their plan to leave was taking shape. Portland, Oregon, was their destination, a city known for its openness and opportunity. Helen had given them enough money to cover a deposit on an apartment, a secret she kept from Richard. Brandon, now 21, felt a flicker of hope, but the shadow of Jake's vendetta loomed large. Ethan, at 23, was resolute, but the strain of his family's rejection was etching lines into his face. Jake's harassment had escalated. He'd started spreading lies online, posting on local forums about Brandon and Ethan, twisting their love into something shameful. The bookstore lost customers, and Clara, though supportive, worried about the business. Brandon felt the weight of every lost sale, every sidelong glance. One night, he broke down in Ethan's arms. "I'm ruining your life," he sobbed. Ethan held him tightly, his voice fierce. "You're the best thing in it." The tension reached a boiling point when Jake confronted them at a gas station. He was with his crew, eyes wild with rage. "You're not leaving," he snarled at Ethan. "You don't get to run off with him." Ethan stepped in front of Brandon, his body tense. "Back off, Jake." The standoff drew a crowd, and for a moment, Brandon thought it would end in blood. A stranger, a burly trucker, intervened, telling Jake to leave. Humiliated, Jake backed down, but his parting words chilled Brandon. This isn't over. Helen's secret support came with risks. Richard discovered her betrayal and exploded, accusing her of enabling Ethan's mistake. He threatened to cut her off too, but Helen stood her ground, her love for her son outweighing her fear. She met Brandon and Ethan in secret, handing over the last of her savings. "Go," she urged. "Build a life where you're free." Brandon hugged her, tears streaming, grateful for the mother he'd lost in his own family. As their departure neared, Brandon faced his own past. He wrote a letter to his parents, not expecting a reply, but needing closure. "I'm happy," he wrote. "I hope one day you can be happy for me." He mailed it, feeling lighter, even when no response came. Ethan, meanwhile, was tying up loose ends, quitting his second job and saying goodbye to his nonprofit colleagues, who threw him a small farewell party. Their support was a reminder that not all of Willow Creek was cruel. But Jake wasn't done. The night before their move, he broke into their apartment. Brandon and Ethan were out, finalizing their plans. When they returned to find their belongings trashed, photos torn, furniture smashed. A note in Jake's scrawl read, "You'll never escape me." Ethan's hands shook as he called the police. But Brandon's resolve hardened. "We're leaving tomorrow," he said. He doesn't get to win. The next morning, they packed their car under Helen's watchful eye. She hugged them both, whispering, "You're stronger than this town." As they drove out of Willow Creek, Brandon looked back at the fading skyline, a mix of relief and sorrow washing over him. Ethan reached for his hand, and, for the first time in years, Brandon felt like he could breathe. Portland was a fresh start, but the ghosts of Willow Creek followed. Jake's online harassment continued, and Richard's influence reached even across state lines, making it hard for Ethan to find work. But they had each other, and that was enough to face whatever came next. Portland's rain-soaked streets welcomed Brandon and Ethan with open arms, a stark contrast to Willow Creek's suffocating judgment. Their new apartment was small, but theirs, filled with secondhand furniture and the promise of a fresh start. Brandon, now 22, enrolled in a local university, chasing a degree in literature. Ethan, 24, landed a job at a community center, his passion for helping others reignited. Their love, tested by fire, was stronger than ever, but the past wasn't done with them. Jake's harassment followed them online, his posts growing darker, more obsessive. He'd found Brandon's new social media accounts, leaving comments that twisted Brandon's stomach. Ethan wanted to fight back, but Brandon urged restraint. "He's in Ohio," Brandon said. "He can't touch us here." But the words felt hollow when Ethan's job applications were mysteriously rejected, a shadow of Richard's influence at play. One evening, as they walked through Portland's vibrant downtown, a stranger recognized them from Jake's posts. "You're those guys from Willow Creek," he said, his tone curious rather than cruel. It was a wake-up call. They couldn't outrun their story, but they could rewrite it. Brandon started a blog, sharing their journey, the bullying, the love, the fight for freedom. It gained traction, connecting them with others who'd faced similar struggles. Messages of support poured in, a reminder that they weren't alone. Helen visited, her first time leaving Willow Creek in years. She marveled at their new life, her eyes shining with pride. "You've built something beautiful," she said, hugging them tightly. She brought news. Richard had softened. Not enough to apologize, but enough to stop interfering. Jake, however, was spiraling, his anger alienating even his old friends. Helen hoped he'd find peace, but Brandon wasn't so sure. The turning point came when Jake showed up in Portland. He tracked him down, his face gaunt, his eyes haunted. He stood outside their apartment, not threatening, but broken. "I don't get it," he said to Ethan, his voice cracking. "Why him?" Ethan didn't flinch. "Because he makes me whole." For the first time, Jake didn't lash out. He left without a word, and Brandon wondered if it was a truce or a retreat. Months later, Brandon's blog caught the attention of a local publisher. He was offered a chance to turn their story into a book, a chance to inspire others. He and Ethan worked on it together, pouring their hearts into every word. The process was cathartic, a way to reclaim their narrative. When the book was published, it wasn't a bestseller, but it touched lives. Letters from readers, teens, parents, survivors thanked them for their courage. Years passed, and Portland became home. Brandon graduated. Ethan rose in his career, and their apartment filled with memories, photos of trips, ticket stubs, a ring on each of their fingers after a quiet courthouse wedding. Jake never reached out again, but Helen shared that he'd moved away, seeking help. Richard sent a single letter, a grudging acknowledgement of their marriage. But it was enough. One autumn evening, as they sat by a lake reminiscent of Willow Creeks, Brandon reflected on their journey. The bullying, the family war, the pain, it had all led to this moment. Their hands entwined, their hearts full. "We made it," he whispered. Ethan smiled, brushing a lock of hair from Brandon's forehead. "We always will." Their story wasn't just about surviving hate. It was about building love in its place. And in that love, they found a victory no one could take away.